Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this. Now, let's begin. It was the first day of July, 1888, and Madrid baked beneath the weight of a fierce Castilian summer. The streets of the Hospicio district shimmered in the late evening heat, the gas lamps flickering at the corners of Fuencarral Street, as residents retreated behind shuttered windows to escape the stifling air. The smell of horse manure and dust rose from the cobblestones, mingling with the faint sweetness of bread from a nearby establishment. It was, by all appearances, an ordinary summer night in a city growing restless with modernity. New boulevards had been drawn, new newspapers printed, new voices clamouring to be heard. The apartment at number 109 Fuencarral Street occupied the second floor, left side of the building, and it belonged to Doña Luciana Borcino, known throughout the neighbourhood simply as the Widow Varela. She had lived there for many years, a woman of comfortable means and formidable temperament, generous to those who impressed her and exacting of those in her employ. That evening the building was quiet. The Widow Varela had retired to her room. Her new housemaid, who had been in her service for fewer than 6 days, had set about her final duties of the night. Before dawn broke over Madrid, the curtains would draw, the whispers would begin, and nothing in that building or in that city would be as it had been. Doña Luciana Borcino was a woman of 50 years and of considerable standing. She had been born in Vigo, the port city of Galicia, on the Atlantic coast of northwestern Spain, in a period when that city was still a modest maritime settlement, its population modest, its harbour busy with fishing vessels and the rough commerce of the sea. The exact year of her birth is not recorded in the surviving sources, though her age at the time of her death was established as 50 years. She had come to Madrid many years before, the wife of a man surnamed Vázquez-Varela, and had remained in the capital long after widowhood had claimed her. Her husband had left her in possession of an income that, by the standards of her district, was remarkable. It was said that her assets yielded her a rental income in the region of 50,000 euros a year, a sum that, in the working neighbourhoods of Madrid, amounted to a minor fortune. She did not live lavishly. The apartment on Fuencarral Street was described as modest in scale, though respectable in its appointments. She was known in the neighbourhood for charitable works, for attending Mass, and for a disposition that was, in equal measure, generous and severe. Those who knew her described a woman of strong character. She was, by multiple accounts, difficult to serve. The housemaids who passed through her employment rarely endured beyond a matter of weeks. Her temper, it was said, was quick to rise and slow to pass, and she expected from those in her service a standard that few could long sustain. Her only son, José Vázquez-Varela Borcino, 23 years of age, and known in the streets of Madrid by the nicknames Varelita and El Pollo Varela, had brought her a particular grief. He was recorded as a young man of disorderly habits, frequently in the company of individuals known to the constabulary for theft, violence, and dishonest dealing. He had been imprisoned on 3 separate occasions. The first imprisonment had followed an act of violence against his own mother, Luciana herself. The second had come after he stabbed his lover, a woman named Dolores Gutierrez Robles, known in the neighbourhood as Lola la Billetera, who sold lottery tickets at the corner of Alcalá and Sevilla streets. The third, and most recent, was for the theft of a cloak at the Café Mazzantini in Madrid. At the time of his mother's death, he remained confined in the Castle Modelo prison on that third charge. The quarrels between mother and son had been a familiar sound in the building. Neighbours reported them with regularity. Voices raised, demands made, denials given. Almost always, the disputes had concerned money. The widow Varela had refused to simply yield to her son's demands. That refusal, it seemed, had become the permanent rhythm of their relationship. Request, refusal, argument, silence. Then again, Higinia Balaguer Ostalé had been born on the 11th of January 1860 in the small town of Ainzon, in the province of Zaragoza, in the region of Aragon. She was the fifth child of Mariano Balaguer Lamata and Petra Ostalé Gil, a family of unremarkable station in a provincial community of modest means. She had come to Madrid in search of domestic employment, as many young women from the provinces did in those years, and had passed through several households before finding herself in the service of the widow Varela. She was described in official documents as tall, ungainly in bearing, with an olive complexion, sharp black eyes, and features of considerable hardness. Those who encountered her during the investigation noted the same quality again and again, a composure, almost unnatural in the circumstances, that officers of the constabulary found more troubling than distress would have been. Before her employment in Fuencarral Street, Higinia had lived for some years in an arrangement with a man named Evaristo Abad-Mayoral, known informally as El Cojo Mayoral, who operated a drinking establishment directly opposite the Cárcel Modelo prison. He was a man of poor reputation. When he died, Higinia had passed into service in the household of Don José Millán Astre, the interim director of that same Cárcel Modelo, the very prison in which El Pollo Varela was then confined. It was Millán Astre himself who had recommended Higinia to Doña Luciana as a housemaid in June of 1888. She had been in the widow Varela's service for approximately 6 days at the time of the murder. What had passed between them in those 6 days is not fully known. What the subsequent investigation established was that the household dog, a bulldog described by neighbours as aggressive towards strangers and fiercely loyal to its mistress, had been sedated with a narcotic substance prior to the crime. Lamp oil had been purchased and brought into the apartment. These were not the actions of a moment's fury. They required preparation. They required knowledge of the household. They required time. The dog that growled at strangers did not bark that night. The lamp oil was ready. The door to the apartment showed no sign of forced entry. One must note what is not there as much as what is. The door was not forced. The dog did not bark. The oil was already purchased. These three silences tell a story that the noise of the subsequent investigation could never quite drown out. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, on the 2nd of July, 1888, the residents of number 109 Fuencarral Street were roused by the smell of smoke and, according to some accounts, the sound of voices raised in the upper corridor. Dense black smoke was observed, issuing from one of the 5 balcony windows of the second floor, left apartment. The building's doorman, Manuel Trevino, went directly to the guard court of the Hospicio district and reported what he had observed. He requested judicial authorization to enter the apartment. Judge Don Felipe Peña, described by those present as an energetic and active official, accompanied Trevino and 2 constables to the building without delay. The door was broken down. The scene within was one that the officers who entered would not readily forget. In the main bedroom, lying face upward on the floor at the foot of the bed, barefoot, was the body of Doña Luciana Borcino. She had been covered with rags soaked in lamp oil, which had been set alight within the closed room. The fire had not spread beyond the immediate vicinity of the body, suggesting that the intention had been to obscure rather than to destroy, to conceal evidence of what had already been done, rather than to burn the apartment itself. Closer examination of the body before removal, revealed 3 distinct stab wounds to the chest. Blood staining remained visible beneath the partially charred rags. The preliminary assessment established that the stabbing had preceded the setting of the fire, that Doña Luciana had not died in the flames. In an adjacent room, officers discovered 2 figures unconscious upon the floor, the household bulldog and Higinia Balaguer Ostalé. Both were identified as having been rendered insensible by a narcotic substance. Higinia was revived by attending officials. Upon awakening and observing the scene, she wept with apparent desperation. According to the record, no evidence of forced entry to the apartment was found. The drawers and personal effects of the residence showed signs of disturbance, yet money and items of value remained in several rooms, which led the investigating officials to doubt, from the outset, that simple robbery had been the primary motive. It was recorded that same morning. The murder had most likely occurred on the evening of the 1st of July, some hours before the alarm was raised. The investigation had begun. It would not resolve cleanly. The medical examination of Doña Luciana Borcino's remains established the cause of death with some precision. The post-mortem findings, as recorded in the proceedings of the investigation, determined that she had received 3 stab wounds to the chest. Of these 3 wounds, one was identified as fatal. It had severed the cartilage of the 5th rib, penetrating through the pericardium and through the heart itself. Death, the examining physicians concluded, would have been near instantaneous following the delivery of that wound. The head and the upper portions of the body exhibited charring consistent with the application of burning oil-soaked material post-mortem. The attending medical officers confirmed formally what the scene had suggested. The fire had been set after death, not before. Doña Luciana had not suffered the flames. She had been stabbed and she had died, and only then had the rags been laid upon her and ignited. The time of death was placed at approximately 10 o'clock in the evening on the 1st of July, 1888, several hours before the alarm was raised by the residents below. The household bulldog, which neighbours had consistently described as a creature hostile to all strangers and highly protective of its mistress, had been sedated. The means by which it was rendered insensible was identified as a narcotic substance, though the specific compound was not recorded in the sources available. The fact of its sedation was, to the investigating officials, among the most significant elements of the physical evidence. The dog did not tolerate strangers. Whosoever had sedated, it had done so from within the apartment, and with sufficient time and familiarity to act without arousing the animal's suspicion. Judge Don Felipe Peña ordered Higinia Balaguer held in custody, incommunicado, pending further examination. The official determination was that there existed sufficient indication of criminality to proceed against her as the primary suspect. A statement was then requested from José Vázquez-Varela Borcino, who was interviewed at the Cárcel Modelo. He stated that he was unaware of any enemies his mother might have possessed, though he acknowledged her irascible character. If you're finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories from history. We also read every comment, so let us know your thoughts on this case below. Now, let's continue. As the investigation deepened in the days that followed, Higinia's statements underwent repeated revision. She first claimed complete ignorance of events. She then alleged that an intruder had entered the apartment. She then named El Pollo Varela himself as the man who had compelled her, under threat and violence, to purchase the oil, to clean the blood, and to set the fire, claiming that he had thereafter forced her to swallow a substance rendering her unconscious. Varela, confined in the Castle Modello at the recorded time, denied all involvement. His prison record presented an immediate difficulty for her account. The trial opened on the 26th of March, 1889, at the Palace of the Supreme Court in Madrid, 8 months and 25 days after the crime had been committed. Public anticipation had not diminished in those months. It had, if anything, intensified. Crowds began forming before the palace gates at 9 o'clock on the preceding evening. Spectators queued through the warm Madrid night in the hope of securing one of the limited places within the courtroom. When the bailiff opened the first session at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, his cry echoed through a room so densely attended that the air within it had already grown close and warm. Hearing in the case against Higinia Balaguer and others for homicide, robbery and arson. 4 individuals stood accused: Higinia Balaguer Ostalé, Dolores Avila, José Vázquez-Varela Borcino and José Millán Astray, the interim director of the Castle Modello. The trial would extend across 36 sessions and hear the testimony of 165 witnesses. The defence of Higinia Balaguer had been entrusted to Nicolás Salmerón, a former president of the First Spanish Republic, a man who had previously resigned that office rather than ratify a death sentence, and who had accepted this case without charge. His presence alone drew additional attention and political weight to the proceedings. The prosecution exercised the newly established right of action popular, a legal innovation introduced under the government of Praxedis Mateo Sagasta, permitting private citizens and press institutions to present themselves as accusatory parties. Francisco Silvela led that effort initially before withdrawing. Joaquín Ruiz Jiménez assumed the role thereafter. The prosecution established, across its sessions, that Higinia had been planning the theft of her mistress's money from the day of her engagement. It was demonstrated that the oil had been purchased in advance of the crime. It was proven that the bulldog had been deliberately narcotized. A connection was established between Higinia and Millán Astray, rooted in her earlier cohabitation with El Cojo Mayoral, whose drinking establishment sat directly opposite the prison Millán Astray directed. The suggestion that El Pollo Varela had moved freely in and out of his cell, a practice not unknown at the Castle Modello, was raised, examined, and ultimately could not be substantiated with evidence sufficient to sustain his conviction. On the 25th of May, 1889, the court delivered its ruling. Higinia Balaguer Ostalé was found guilty of the combined offence of robbery and homicide. She was sentenced to death. Dolores Avila was convicted as an accomplice and sentenced to 18 years imprisonment. José Vázquez-Varela Borcino and José Millán Astray were acquitted. The courtroom, by all surviving accounts, received the verdict in near silence. The verdict did not settle Madrid. It divided it. In the coffee houses of the Hospicio district, in the Café Gijón and the Café de las Salesas, in the tertulias and the taverns and the doorways of the working streets, the argument continued long after the court had spoken. Those who had called themselves higienistas, who had believed the maid to be innocent, or at least less culpable than the circumstances alleged, considered the judgment an act of class resentment rather than justice. The conviction of a servant woman, they argued, while a young man of bourgeois ease and a prison director with powerful connections walked free. The Varelistas, meanwhile, found in the verdict only the confirmation of what they had maintained from the first morning. The press had, throughout the entire affair, been an instrument of a power that could not be jailed. El Liberal and La Correspondencia de España and the newspaper El País had devoted daily columns to every new development, every contradiction, every rumour and whisper that emerged from the investigation and the trial. For the first time in Spain's history, scholars have since observed a crime had generated what might be called a parallel trial. Conduct not in a courtroom but in the streets, the coffee houses, and the printed page, where the press fed upon public opinion, and public opinion fed, in turn, upon the press. The case is credited by historians of Spanish journalism as having introduced the age of sensationalist reporting to Spain. It changed, scholars at the University of Cadiz have noted, the manner in which journalism itself was practiced. The consequences of the verdict extended beyond Higinia Balaguer. José Millán Astre, though acquitted, could not survive the scandal of his association with the case. He stepped down from his position as interim director of the Cárcel Modelo. Eugenio Montero Rios, the president of the Supreme Court and Millán Astre's known political protector, found his name drawn into the affair in ways that compelled his own resignation thereafter. Appeals delayed the execution for more than a year. On the morning of Saturday, the 19th of July, 1890, Higinia Balaguer Ostalé was transferred to the courtyard of the Cárcel Modelo, where a scaffold had been constructed upon the prison walls. The method of execution was the garrote vil. She was 30 years of age. Approximately 20,000 people were present. They gathered on the far side of the prison walls, on the rooftops and elevated ground of the surrounding streets, in the grey pre-dawn light of a Madrid summer morning. Among those who witnessed the execution were the novelist Benito Pérez Galdós, who had attended the trial and sent dispatches to the Argentine newspaper La Prensa, and the writer Emilia Pardo Bazán. The Duke of Veragua was present. The Mayor of Madrid was present. In the moments before the instrument was applied, Higinia cried out words that have never been fully explained. Dolores 14,000 duros. Dolores 14,000 duros. Some interpreted it as a reference to stolen money. Others heard in it an accusation, a final naming of a person she believed had escaped their share of the accounting. No one has ever resolved the question with certainty. The phrase passed into the public record and remained there unanswered. Her final savings, 136 pesetas in total, were distributed according to her last wishes. 34 pesetas sent to the Basilica of Our Lady of the Pillar in Zaragoza for prayers on her behalf, and the remainder to the parish church of Inzon, her place of birth, for the same purpose. Her body, after remaining exposed for the 9 hours required by law, was interred in the cemetery of the East. It was the last public execution ever carried out in Madrid. In the years that followed, El Pollo Varela found that acquittal had not delivered him from consequence. He was subsequently implicated in the suspicious death of a woman who fell from an upper floor on the Calle de la Montera in Madrid. Convicted on that later charge, he was sentenced to 14 years' imprisonment at the fortress of Monte Hacho in Ceuta. During his confinement, he studied the art of photography. Upon his release, he opened a studio which achieved a measure of success. Nothing further is recorded of him. The apartment at number 109 Fuencarral Street passed in time through other hands. Urban renumbering eventually changed its designation. The building that once bore that infamous address came to carry the number 95, at the corner with Divino Pastor Street. A guest house is said to have occupied its rooms in later years. The original number no longer exists on the street map. The sequence runs from 107 to 111, with the entrance to the Glorieta de Bilbao roundabout standing in the space between. Two expressions entered the popular speech of Madrid in the aftermath of the case, and were still in use for years after: to be more famous than the crime of Fuencarral Street, and to be like the porter of Fuencarral. In the records of the Audiencia de Madrid, the case file remains. 2 volumes, the proceedings printed and bound in 1889, the pages yellowed now, the testimony of 165 witnesses preserved within. The dog that did not bark on the night of the 1st of July, the oil that was already purchased, the door that was not forced, and the words of a woman on a scaffold in the pale morning light of a city that had already made up its mind, words no one in all the years since has been entirely able to explain.